Welcome to the Outside Salon. This is the second of the season. More will come, but this is the second of the season, the last of the year. As some of you know, the Outside Salon is an organization, and there's me, Roberta Bujani, and Stephen Morris, who are here in spirit, who are organizing this thing, and we are trying to foster dialogue across not only the art and science, but also across disciplines. This is a big, hot debate, which has been debated in many countries and in many environments. In Canada, not so much. But we'll hear from one of our guest speakers who maybe is only the academic level, that it hasn't been discussed too much, as usual. Sorry, I'm recording, I'm streaming, so like, hello. This event is going to be recorded and streamed, so some people from the States, hi, people from the States, are listening. And as I always remind them whenever I cross the border, Canada is a particular special place to have certain discussions. There's a lot of problematics that come out that are not necessarily discussed in the States. So please, people from the States, listen to us. So I hope there will be some people who do. So this is it for the moment. So whenever this event will be over, the recording of this event will be archived, and it will be available on the Field's website under the archives, or soon after in our YouTube channel. In order to reach our YouTube channel, if you go to artsidesalon.com, you will find all the information you need in order to get to our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, to see some of the artists who've been through this endeavor, etc., and the past talks, etc. So without further ado, I would like to start this meeting. But before I start, I would like to do a little acknowledgement, which is due. So I would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. In fact, it has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. And this land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And pardon my accent. The territory was the subject of the Dish with one spoon, one plume belt covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. I'm not going further. You know the stick. It is important to acknowledge this, especially because we are at the University of Toronto. And let's start. So today our meeting is called STEAM. What is A in STEAM? As many of you know, there's a STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. What happens when we put an A in STEM? So we will have 5 speakers. They will engage us with their projects and their visions for 5 to 7 minutes each. After that, we will open the floor, and we have like this very long lineup of chairs, and we will have hopefully a constructive conversation. So the speakers go in alphabetical order, in the order that are indicated in the poster. So I would like to introduce you to Linda Duvall, who is a Canadian interdisciplinary artist who presents within gallery context on the web and within public and private spaces. I really encourage you to see her website, which is fantastic. Her work exists at the intersection of collaboration, intimate performances, and research in action. She has been identified as a rebel sociologist by curator Kim Simon for her emphasis on discourse rather than empirical outcome. Duvall has completed degrees in sociology and English at Carleton University in Ottawa, in education at Queen's University in Kingston, and in visual arts at Okai University. The University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Transart Institute through Plymouth University in the UK. She has taught for many years at the University of Saskatchewan and is currently a professional affiliate there. Her work has been extensively presented, including exhibitions in Guatemala, London, Barcelona, Slovenia, Shanghai, Berlin, and across Canada. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you. So first I want to tell you that I'm using a new computer with a new program. So the images may not match. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here to discuss this important issue, and thanks to David and Dolores.
Is it okay like this?
No. Just a little bit of light?
No, it's
It's all or nothing? Okay. Okay, back to thanking David and Dolores for organizing this session. As Roberta said, I'm a practicing visual artist. I love art. I live for art. So it seemed logical that I would support the inclusion of an art component into the STEM educational model. But I have difficulty with the notion of adding an A to STEM in the ways that it's often proposed. Here are some examples of the approaches. Some of the approaches that make me uneasy. And I'm just read in this one, all STEM projects can be easily turned into STEAM projects by using some simple craftsmanship to add design or detailed elements to a project. Or this one, students may apply design and decoration to products that were created during the course of a design challenge. They could use computer graphics to create logos or stylized designs to include in communication or presentation. In both of these examples, art is equated with decoration, with adding something on, with some token inclusion. It's not integral to the whole process. Even the opponents to STEAM see art as a separate entity, particularly the last one, So, I would propose that if STEAM is to be introduced into educational curriculum, there needs to be a reconsideration of the core elements constituting an artistic process. And once that is more clearly understood, then the A in STEAM will be a valued and central participant in any STEAM project. So, what is an artistic process from my perspective? Any art project that I develop begins with questions and with no assumptions of specific answers. For me, it is about an exploration, a paying attention, about research in action. I'm going to show you my most recent project as an example. This project began as an investigation of a 6-foot hole that I had earlier dug on my property in rural Saskatchewan. So I'm not going to go into all the details about this project, but the short version is that I spent 65 nearly consecutive days in this hole with people from different parts of the world and from different backgrounds. Each person spent 6 hours a day in the hole with me. I began every day with a simple history of the land as Treaty 6 land originally formed by glacial action and with untilled native prairie. Then each person led an exploration of the whole based on their interests, expertise, and questions, and background. There was never suggested there was a final answer or even a final question. There was a defined framework within which we worked, but we were all free to consider scientific, engineering, geological, biological, historical, or other approaches. And you can sort of see why all of those become part of a project where you're sitting in a hole. Some people brought a knowledge of indigenous history with them. Some explored the small glacial stones. Most responded to the changing weather condition. And this is a woman from Sweetgrass Reserve. And for that one, we sat in silence for 2 days of 6 hours each. Some studied the bank swallows that were resident in the hole with us. Some focused on the bugs. Many just listened or touched or looked. And every day I learned something about this space in which I had personally spent years. At the same time, each participant gained new understandings. This particular person was a bird expert and set us both to annotate systematically what we saw minute by minute in what I understood as a scientific approach. But when he compared our respective notes, he realized that we weren't seeing the same things or hearing the same things. And this totally opened up a new process for him. This project began as an open-ended idea that was supported within the context of art funding, but that invited and incorporated so many other kinds of input. In short, art is not about finding an answer. Often the actual art is about the process, as in this case. I feel that art has a crucial contribution to make to educational systems, but only if it is central to the process, not just an add-on. Surely to include art in the STEM paradigm, it must be for reasons of its contribution to the academy. Art must have an earned place rather than tokenistic inclusion. Artistic strategies lend themselves to partnerships or collaboration with other disciplines, but they must be seen as equal players. And that's an actual poster from the mid-50s, Senator Joseph McCarthy, when everyone was afraid of artists. And I almost wonder if that's when that division between art and everything else started, because, I assume you know that history where they went after artists. Okay, thank you.
It's still up. Okay. Okay, so we have... Thanks, Linda. So next speaker is Richard Blackman. Richard directs the Zone Learning Network of Incubators for Ryerson University, research development for the Faculty of Communication and Design, and the Experiential Media Institute. His research interests include transmedia storytelling, digital documentaries, augmented locative VR experiences, mixed realities, and collaborative design thinking. So welcome, Richard.
And this will let me, I can walk around with this one? Yeah. Is that right?
Put it very close to your...
Okay.
I can adjust it.
Okay. Is that broadcasting?
I think that's good.
Yeah?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I get to wear a bib for the entire time. That is lovely. Thanks. So what I want to talk about in what the A stands for in STEAM for me is, I'm interpreting it broadly. STEAM for me means, A and C means arts and humanities. And I'm broadly interpreting it that way because to sort of misquote Allen Ginsberg, I've seen the best minds of my generation spend their lives optimizing milliseconds out of high-frequency trading algorithms or figuring out the best delivery routes for drone delivery of burritos. I am worried about the challenges that we're choosing to work on, that we're applying the tools of science, we're applying the tools of engineering and technology to problems that generate a lot of revenue but don't generate a lot of benefit for society. And we are in a situation where minor variations in trading algorithms, minor variations in advertising optimization algorithms lead to financial reward. And I can't individually here on a stage in Toronto modify that. What we can modify, or we can try and convince people of, is the value of their own work, the connections that we have when we do our work to the rest of society, to the rest of humanity. And I feel that that one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now is due to a lack of connection, a lack of empathy. And I believe that I can't teach you exactly how to build empathy, but I do know a path is through the humanities. There's a path is through arts. There's a path through literature. These are ways to connect the work that we do and the values that we have to other human beings around us. We are in the middle of a crisis which feels like anti-intellectualism happening right now. This has happened for years here in Canada. This is happening right now in the United States. A sense that the universities are distant from us, that science and technology and engineering is very distant from the day-to-day lives of people. And we got ourselves there. We got ourselves here by distancing ourselves, by creating tools that seem extremely distant, by building some of the tools that result in the massive economic disparity, by challenging comments around ethics, responsibility, citizenship. These are things that I feel like are the largest questions that we have to deal with now. So in addition to the scientific challenges that we have, in addition to progressing society, I feel like we are in a world where we've invented things that right now I would say the biggest challenges are not just increasing an algorithm or optimizing something, but when I look at developments like CRISPR-Cas9, this is like a development like the atomic bomb. I think that is not an overstatement. The challenges that this opens up for us are things we can advance in terms of science incrementally. We can make the developments, but the tool with CRISPR-Cas9, I'm not going to go into huge details, but I'm assuming you've started to see some of the press filtering out of the scientific journals into this now. It allows very precise editing of genomes, of RNA and DNA sequences. And the ability to do this is not incredibly complicated. Jennifer Doudna, one of the co-creators, has described it as, with a bachelor's in biology, you can use this to edit DNA. So the questions we have while perfecting this, while developing new techniques are, what are we going to do with this? Is editing the germline? Is editing human DNA, infants? Are these things we should be doing if we're going to do it, if it's going to happen somewhere? What are the ethics we need to govern this? What okay do we need from wider society? What okays do we need from individuals who are being experimented on or might have genetic processes applied to them? These are ethical questions. And the people who are best positioned to deal with them are scientists and engineers and technologists. Because the training in a typical politician might get might not allow them to really see the details that are involved in this. When I look at the involvement in the development of algorithms, software inputs into our daily lives. So there are software algorithms, algorithms themselves are, of course, as old as any set of steps for solving a problem. But we are now starting to give control over our society to black box algorithms. So there are algorithms that are used to help with sentencing guidelines for criminals, based on analysis of data, analysis of who you are based on some data points. These black box algorithms are developed by private companies. They're sold to the court systems, and no one knows what's inside the algorithm. So in other words, if I, as an individual, am making a decision, a recommendation, you can grill me about what's going into my recommendation. And if it turns out I'm subject to racial bias, or I'm subject to gender bias, and you can prove that, you can find it out, then I'm liable for it. When we develop a black box piece of software that just says, well, here's a bunch of data, here's the defendant before me, I'm going to come up with a single numerical score for them, and I'm not going to tell you how I did it. I don't have to tell you how I did it because I'm a private company, and that's my trade secret. My business is based on not telling you how I'm going to solve these problems. This is happening in sentencing. This is happening in employment evaluation. This is happening in analysis of your social media feeds in order to determine whether you get a job or you can rent an apartment. We're giving more and more control over these questions, where the technological question is interesting, but the ethical output in society is the part where we need to have much more conversation. And again, the people who need to be learning these skills and connecting more with society are the developers, are the engineers, are the CEOs of a company who came up through the engineering path, who developed the algorithm. We are moving into a world where what's called solutionism sometimes. We're getting the Silicon Valley billionaire who has a particular approach to solving certain kinds of problems because they were able to develop an advertising scheme or a Facebook app that gave them the money, and now to start to treat everything as this small, solvable problem. So we get the tech billionaire moving into education and saying, I can solve education. Here's my app. Here's my software platform. When these are really much more complicated problems. They're human-scale problems. They are embedded in our society. And the path I have towards that understanding is through the arts and humanities. I do want to make a point, very much to Linda's excellent point. I'd like to add my weight. This is not something you gloss over top. It's not the pretty little curly-cue you add to a piece of technology. Richard Feynman very famously talked about cargo cult science, where he said, it's possible to do science where you throw some pretty graphs at it. You throw the trappings of science on top with missing the sort of details, the deep underlying thought that might be there. And we're getting cargo cult STEAM, cargo cult art sometimes. We're saying, develop a thing and paint it blue. Oh, sure, we need to have for our students an arts and humanities requirement. So there are now, you just find the simplest course that's there and you take that course. We see this on the other side. Humanities might have a science requirement. And so we get, the simplest geology class. Many universities have things labeled rocks for jocks. How do I get out of this requirement as simply as possible? So I am suggesting we need STEAM education, but it's not just a liberal arts requirement. I think we need to think through how to make specific courses where these are specific goals. Because when we look at science, technology, engineering, math, all of the courses you're taking are advancing a particular goal. They're helping you meet a particular tool, a particular equation, a particular type of science. Similarly, if we think that the value of this is around advancing connection to people, understanding ethics, then it might be particular classes that we require, not just any of an elective. So there are computer science ethics classes trying to now deal with the questions of algorithm design. I do want to harken back. The question we're having now is not brand new. C.P. Snow very famously had this controversial talk at the time at Oxford in 1959 called The Two Cultures. And what he was talking about there was he was observing in post-war Britain that there had started to be this schism between the scientists on one side and the arts and humanities on the other. And there was starting to be this lack of understanding across that had not been there prior to World War II, at least in his reading. And that not only was there this, the scientists weren't understanding the humanities and the humanities weren't understanding the science, but they were proud of it. That he would ask the question of scientists, what do you read? And they would say, I read for work. Well, what else am I going to spend my time doing? And he would ask the humanitarians, the humanities scholars, what's the second law of thermodynamics? And they would say, I don't care. But that's as fundamental one is to the other. We have a lack of literacy on one side, and we have a lack of numeracy or understanding on the other. Continuing down this path is not going to be helpful. It's leading to this division and this separation. So once again, my final exhortation is that I see the need for this because I feel the greatest challenges we have we're inventing things that the only way we can develop an ethical treatment and one that's going to benefit humanity is if the people doing those acts of creation themselves are thinking through the larger questions.
Thank you so much, Richard and Linda, for these both thought-provoking discussions. I think we're going to have quite an animated discussion later on. So the next speaker is Jacqueline, who is a teacher librarian at ESP. Over the last 2 years, she has led a team to organize a STEAM conference for approximately 180 students and intermediate from Queen Victoria Public School in Garden. The purpose of the conference is to inspire these young people and to show them what they can also aspire to. Not necessarily in science, also but in other disciplines. So Queen Victoria has a history of promoting the arts and education, and so the conference was also partly to expand the national stand to incorporate the arts and creativity. And I think this is like fantastic, and we will things that she brought. So welcome, Jan, and thanks so much for agreeing to come here. Thank you.
I forgot, well, blah, blah, blah. Jan Mcmunn. So you're going to...
And I also have to make sure. Can everybody hear me at the back?
No, it has to be a bit higher. Thank you. Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Is that better? Okay, good. Yeah, I don't have a good ability to project, so I want to make sure you can hear me. I also just have to... There we go. All right. Hopefully that's not going to be distracting. I want to say, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. I really, so far, I'm so excited to have been able to hear these opinions about science, technology, engineering and math, and art, of course, in its role. So I have to tell you that what I'm going to tell you is very much from the point of view of an elementary school teacher and from the public education point of view. I'm kind of here by accident in many ways. In my private life, I'm a writer as well as being a teacher. But when I got into the teaching profession, I was really taken by the storytelling, and I developed a real love for storytelling, which as a librarian and a teacher, I always wanted to involve children in, because I think oral language is a really important part of developing literacy skills. So I stumbled kind of along for a long time, and I finally decided that I was going to run a storytelling workshop at the school. The school is, currently we have 810 students, and I run the library on a half-time basis. So the other half of the time I teach drama. So that's kind of what I do. In terms of the arts, I wanted to do a storytelling workshop with the school, and I decided that the teachers weren't going to buy into it, which I think says a lot about art on the one hand, because the school itself very much has a background in art and has integrated it historically, as Roberta was saying. For example, my friend Sue, a number of years ago, was teaching mapping skills to grade 5, and she developed a project where the kids had to make a map of their heart. And it started off with all kinds of creative map making, and then they made the leap into actually reading other maps. So from the point of view of an educator, I had to find something that I could sell to the teachers and that the kids would buy into. And I wanted to do the storytelling workshop, but I decided to incorporate it into STEAM because the school is sort of on the cutting edge anyway, and there's a lot of talk about STEAM in education generally, and there's quite a push from the ministry level down and from the board level down to develop different STEAM activities in the schools. Now, I'm not going to be able to talk too much about what the arts, from the point of view that Linda and Richard have spoken about. But I can show you
An example of the kind of thing that we've done. I'll just let you know.
this is our 4th annual STEAM conference
Coming up, and we've had a number of really excellent keynotes. Chris Hadfield was our first keynote speaker 4 years ago. 3 years ago, we had.
We lost the microphone.
Lost the microphone? Okay. So much for science. How's that? Is it better now? Okay. So we had Chris Hadfield one year, then we had Graham Diamond. He's Canada's first Lego brick master, and I'm going to show you a video where he was our keynote speaker. And I think he addresses the issue of creativity really succinctly just say that. Last year we had Erica Scarf. She's a Canadian Paralympian athlete, and she was our keynote speaker. This year we have Autumn Pelche coming. She's a water walker. She's 14 years old. She's from the Six Nations community on Manitoulin Island. So our focus this year is on water and sustainability. Without further ado, I'm going to just show you the video. Sorry, volume's an issue here. I don't know how to turn it up.
Because I think it's on.
Maybe it's just on this computer.
Yeah.
There's no speaker. That's too bad.
Sorry.
try that.
The STEAM conference allows... Oh,
Thank you very much.
And I think that the arts is a really great way as a lens to try and look at those. And to bring creativity to solve some of the problems that might arise in those issues.
STEAM stands for science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math.
The STEAM conference allows students to develop their inquiry and problem-solving skills through a whole variety of different activities.
I think STEAM is really important for me as an artist. I think infusing the arts into things is a really valid way of engaging different creativities. I mean, I'm not necessarily a mathematician or an engineer. Science was not always my bag, but I am an artist, and I think that the arts is a really great way as a lens to try and look at those and to bring creativity to solve some of the problems that might arise in those issues.
I think it's really important for students to have an early exposure to science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. There definitely wasn't enough when I was a kid, and it's really good to have more exposure, more introductions into different science realms.
Trying to show the kids that you have to think big and that everybody wants to make the connections or needs to make the connections in every aspect of their life, really.
I mean, every kid grows up wondering why things are, answering questions like, how do airplanes fly? And that's what science is all about.
The goal for today, I'd say, is really to give kids a hands-on experience of the kinds of things that people do in the careers that we've kind of focused on here in STEAM.
We feel like that it's so important for them because we wanted to give them so many opportunities to explore the potential of where they want to go after, let's say.
Encouraging kids to really think about, science, technology, engineering, math, those are really important, but it's that creative process, that artistic element that comes into it and brings it all together that's really going to propel the next generation forward and create those really innovative new jobs and drive innovation in the future as well.
Here we've got the students designing and programming robots. They're asking questions like, what will happen if I change the power to the motors? And they actually get to develop experiments to test their hypotheses.
What we're doing for it is a zombie apocalypse engineering activity. So the focus is super, super hands-on, super teamwork based, very collaborative, lots of communication, but it also brings in attributes of engineering that you'd actually have to apply in the real world. So it kind of tries to make engineering super fun and sneaky, so they don't necessarily know they're doing engineering activities, but they're doing it in a really fun way.
Students were really fantastic. I mean, one of the pleasures that I have in terms of working in classrooms is that I get to be exposed to young creative brains. To be honest, I wasn't sure how they would respond to the ideation process, but every group that I work with just leapt into it. They came up with some really juicy problems, and they came up with fantastic solutions to it. And we only had a very short period of time, and then we actually got them to pitch them to each other, because that validation process is really important. It's not just the great idea, but actually trying to figure out whether that great idea is going to work in the long term. And that's what they got to do, and each group came up with some really fantastic ideas.
Yeah, I think they've really had fun so far. We've seen them, the first group didn't really know what Rube Goldberg was at all, so they learned about the concept, and then they were actually able to brainstorm ideas, put them together, make a machine, and a lot of kids have been really enthusiastic with the activities so far. A lot of them said that they don't get to do such hands-on work in class, so it stays fun, and it's kind of it's got a real world context. So the kids so far seem like there's lots of laughing, which is good, and like super happy when they complete the activity because it's a tough one to solve. And I think they really like working together.
Students are so engaged. They're excited. You have, adolescent boys that are high-fiving each other because they're so excited about their accomplishments, and they're just the smiles on their faces and the persistence when they face challenges is just really inspiring to see.
So that's a little look at STEAM. I guess the one thing I want to say, and to kind of wrap up, is I think for the children, there's no separation between science and art and technology and art, and their brains just incorporate them all together. And I mean, I think the other thing is that in the public school system, there's a lot of pressure as well to do a lot of things, and those pressures are increasing with special ed needs and stuff like that. So I think it's there just isn't the luxury for art, like the artistic process that you were talking about, Linda. I think there's definitely there needs to be more of that, but it doesn't happen enough. And so this is my attempt to sort of invigorate all of the above disciplines at the public school level. So there you have it.
I'm going to remember to turn this on. Yes. Well, I'm so loud that nobody realizes whether or not I'm using the mic. So our next speaker is Jen Stroud-Rossman, who is a professor of mechanical engineering at Lafayette College. Her research interests include cardiovascular and respiratory fluid mechanics and interdisciplinary pedagogies. Very different subject matters, but we'll see how she's I read your paper, so I know already. Yes, she co-authored. I did my own work. She co-authored an innovative textbook, Introduction to Engineering Mechanics: A Continued Approach. And writes the essay series, An Engineer Reads a Novel. That's very interesting. She's also a fiction writer whose work in journals such as Chip Wrap, Literary Orphans, Tahoma Literary Review has earned several Pushchart Prize nominations and other honors. Her first novel is forthcoming in the fall of 2008. So without further ado, welcome, Jen. You're a truly interdisciplinary person. I see. Okay, sorry. No pressure. Do you want to use this one or do you want to use the other one?
Can y'all hear me? Okay.
No, I mean, you need to use a microphone because we are streaming, but whether you use that one or this one, like if you want to be more mobile, you have to use that one. Otherwise, you can use this one. People will tell you whether or not they hear you.
No doubt.
Yeah.
So hi. So I think I'll be the speaker who cedes my time to the previous speakers because I've so enjoyed listening to them that I would be perfectly happy just to hear more of what they all have to say. So I'm really looking forward to the time we have to chat a bit more. And I'll try to be as brief as possible, though asking a professor to speak for 5 to 7 minutes is a dangerous game indeed. So we were given this sort of a prompt, like what's the role of A in STEM or STEAM, depending on how you want to think about that. And I also thought about the two cultures and how really there's this arbitrary, like why are we talking about these things as separate? When we talk about integrating disciplines, we're talking about reintegrating disciplines that used to just be what it meant to be a civilized, educated citizen of the world. And hopefully we can get back there. Really, frankly, I blame Descartes for the division between materialistic and idealistic thinking. So we could just take down Descartes for the next hour, and that'd be all right with me. But we also have to blame the Cold War, right, and the space race, which made this sort of hierarchy of disciplines, which really it had a negative effect on all of our ability to work together and collaborate and respect each other, because it made it seem like STEM excellence was excellence, and that's false for many reasons that have already been explained today. It's certainly inadequate. A further villain in the story is the modern university system and the fact that we reinforce our silos, we patrol our borders, and we reward ourselves for things that happen within those borders and not enough for transgressing those borders. But having said all that, when I think about what the role of arts and humanities might be in STEM, my own home discipline, I think about just a whole bunch of C words here. And I think about the way arts and humanities can sort of catalyze STEM knowledge and can complement STEM skills and values and can contextualize STEM really meaningfully. And I worry that the first three things you think of there are all the sort of design and decoration things or have the potential to be, right? So there's the pitfall of this hierarchy sort of continuing to seep into the way we think of one field as supporting or enhancing another rather than respecting it as its own discipline. And I think that that's a major pitfall. And I think if we really push ourselves a little harder, we get to this sort of second category of C words, which is we start to think of arts and STEM and arts and humanities and STEM as all collaborating together and connecting together in the way that we could if Descartes had never torn us apart. And then we can think about problems like Richard mentioned, the CRISPR and other situations that we must engage together, right? And we must not just think of ourselves in STEM as problem solvers, but we must be problem definers. We must identify the problems we want to work on, and they must not just be optimizing an algorithm. They must be more meaningful. And if we can't figure out what meaningful problems are on our own, first of all, we as STEM educators are failing. But second of all, we ought to take more advantage of the fact that these other disciplines actually specialize in figuring out what those important problems are and understanding their full impacts and intertwined stakeholders and social structures. So I'm going to talk about a few things that I do that I hope bring us to this place, this second set of C words, collaboration and connection, and also some efforts that I've made to use the A, the arts and humanities, as a way of critiquing STEM. And I think that can also be a really powerful way, another lens to shine upon ourselves. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is a class that I've taught that I co-developed and co-teach with a photographer, an art professor at my institution. Can you guys still hear me? Is this microphone still working? Fabulous. That won't sound awkward at all on your stream. That's great. So the goal of this class is to have students develop a sort of mutual literacy. I think we talked before. I heard Richard say literacy and numeracy. I'm using literacy in both senses, in that you're learning the language, the methods, the syntax, the customs of a discipline. The trick is that I'm doing this at the sophomore level, so students don't really have a discipline yet. Like, they might think they do. They might have a self-identified, well, I'm really a math guy, or I'm really not a math girl, or whatever, but we can, work through that. And in fact, they don't have those disciplinary identities nearly as strongly as they do, or we can help them form them. And so the goal here is to use a tool of mind and research, which is flow visualization, which is a way to make often invisible fluid flow visible using certain techniques like injecting dye, the way it's been done here by a student pair who have injected a little bit of dye in their bathroom sink to see the vortex spiraling, and have found that to be an image that they can compose in a way that is also satisfying aesthetically. So we're hoping that out of this course, students who come with no prior knowledge of photography or art history and no prior knowledge of fluid mechanics will learn both, and will learn how they intersect, how they inform each other in some ways, and that there is also sort of an ethics of making scientific images. So this is the reading list for the course I'm talking about. It contains technical texts with a lot of jargon. It contains art texts with a lot of jargon. And we try, again, we're teaching each other's languages. It's important, I think, that this course is team taught so that we can model and facilitate the kind of dialogue that we want our students to be able to have. Some of you are nodding with recognition, I hope, at some of these really awesome texts. And I want to particularly point out Peter Gallison's book, Objectivity, which is just marvelous. And it's not just his, I should say, it's also Lorraine's. But it's a wonderful text that really talks about the fact that objectivity is a myth, right? And it's especially a powerful myth that we tell ourselves in STEM, that science is pure, and it's just logic and reason. And, well, it's just a coincidence that straight white men are just the best at this because it's so objective, so there couldn't have been any bias baked into the system from the very beginning of time. Coincidence is weird. And it's much more comfortable, I think, for students to think about subjectivity. My STEM students are always saying, well, it's hard for me in my humanities courses because the grading's so subjective. Everything's so subjective there. I'm like, well, the world is subjective. And so this text is a way to not just answer that in a sort of glib way, but actually to interrogate, well, what do you even think objectivity is? Students do a variety of assignments. In lab, they're staging flow visualization labs. They're also finding natural flow visualization in the world. Clouds are a wonderful example of flow visualization. Not coincidentally, have been interrogated by both artists and scientists throughout history. And then we critique these images. We treat it as you might in a studio art class, where we bring the images in and we critique them as a group. We also talk about them scientifically. What is this image actually showing us? Oh, look, it's a horseshoe vortex rolling up at the base of a cylinder. Let's talk about that. But we also learn a little bit of art history, so they can contextualize their images that they make. For example, they learn about Muybridge and Murray and other artists who have used sequencing to sort of structure a narrative with their images. And we talk about the fact that there's an artifice of truth to this when it's presented this way, that artists have very consciously chosen which images to present to us and how to present them, and that scientists do that too. And they make their own images that may mimic this style, and they're now more aware that I made this, I constructed this, I'm presenting it like it's a truth, but it may be more complicated than that. And we get then naturally to what is ethical when presenting one's work as a truth. How much can one manipulate it? One has staged the situation, right? One has created this, but how much of that is okay, and how much of it is, of course, part of what we're here to do, especially when we're doing a lab work. The whole thing was staged, right? I set it all up. But am I presenting something that someone can receive as real or true? And again, what am I comfortable with? And do my standards and my values change depending on the context, depending on the audience, depending on what else accompanies my image, or whether my image needs to stand alone? A second effort is the column series I write that Roberta mentioned so nicely. This series is called An Engineer Reads a Novel, and it's a series of reviews of literary fiction that I write through the lens of an engineer, because I am an engineer. I don't actively put on lenses. It's just how I'm thinking. So as I read literary fiction, I'm doing, of course, the work of developing empathy, and I'm trying to model that. But I'm also thinking about the sort of role and responsibility that I have as a STEM practitioner in society. And I'm seeing what these books tell me about how society has received the technology that STEM has presented to it. For example, you might read Jack Kerouac and decide, the car, it was liberating, it was independence, it was jazz improvisation, it was all good. And then you might read Fitzgerald and say, actually, it seems to be a technology that highlighted our self-centered materialism and our reckless nature. Technology didn't make us that. It revealed both of those sides of humanity. But I'm thinking about that now, and I'm not just thinking about the car as an Otto cycle engine and an aerodynamic shell. So the more I'm aware of this, the more I'm thoughtfully constructing my own identity as a STEM practitioner and maybe inspired to choose my own projects more thoughtfully, think about my methods and values in this context. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about contextualizing and critiquing as the role that arts can be playing in STEM. And so the last thing I'll say about that is another class that I teach about sort of the history of technology, and we do a lot of the reading of these texts and looking at art and films and seeing the way it's reflecting back to us what STEM has wrought or how STEM has interacted with society. And we can sort of reflect on, is that how we want to be received and viewed, or might we want to either take a more active role in creating these perceptions and these products, or might we want to rethink things? And this is a famous image, right? Westward, the course of empire takes its way, by Currier and Ives. And you might see this image in the course of thinking about how the railroad changed everything in many ways. You might think about boiler design and how hoop stress dictated standards for boilers. Or you might think about how the sort of industrialization and urbanization of the West changed everything for a people who are literally sort of stranded in the smoke here in this image, and what that reflects, and what does that make you want to do as STEM. So this to me is a series of things that the A can tell me about what I want to be in STEM. So that's my answer to the question, what is the A in STEM? Thanks.
I was thinking about the same picture, actually. It's very telling. That's amazing. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the last speaker, Lorraine Williams. We have another librarian, special collection librarian, so this time at the Thomas Fisher's Rare Book Library here at U of T, across from Robarts, if you want to check it out. It's beautiful. Her background is in history of printing and bookbinding, and she also volunteered at the Massey College print shop, where she performs letterpress printing demonstrations for visiting students and scholars. In recent years, she has become increasingly interested in exploring the history of science and medicine and the ways in which historical materials can inform the modern study and practice of science and medicine. And I think you curated that show in at the Robarts for the Science Literacy Week, which I didn't see, but I heard so many beautiful things about it. Okay, so thank you very much, and welcome, Lorraine. I'm destroying things here. So, do you want to use this one or that one?
Oh, I'll just use
your choice. Okay.
I'm just gonna. Okay, those are all such amazing presentations to follow. The joys of having W as the first letter of my last name. Is this? Is it working? That's good. Okay, I won't move. Okay, so thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So while my own educational background is purely humanities-based, in my role at the Fisher Library, I've had the opportunity to develop seminars for modern science students, everyone from engineers to chemistry, physics, and med students, where I present to them a variety of historical books from their field, and I try to make these materials relevant to what they're learning now. The Fisher Library is home to hundreds of thousands of books, so choosing appropriate materials for these seminars is always a challenge. But the main factor I've found that helps students connect to these books is the presence of illustrations. As I'm sure we've all experienced in one way or another, the visual representation of an idea is often far more powerful than the text in which it's explained. For example, I can show a group of physics students the 1543 first edition of Copernicus, where he outlines his theory of heliocentrism, and I might see a few eyes widen at the sight of the Latin text. But of the many dozens of students to whom I've shown this book, not a single one has expressed any interest in reading the text, not even an English translation. But when I turn to the front of the book and I show them this incredible annotation, it never fails to draw a chorus of excited gasps from the group, followed by rapid-fire questions about the circumstances surrounding the book. This diagram, drawn by an early owner of the book, transcends history and really has the power to pull students directly into an era where people saw the universe very differently. It compels them to imagine a time before the organization of the solar system was commonly understood, and where the act of reading about a heliocentric system would have been so foreign that a person would have to sketch it out to even begin to wrap his mind around it. So it's moments like these that have begun to illustrate for me the power of visual representations of knowledge. And I hope that this example demonstrates that for me, the A in STEAM, as I'm so glad that other people have touched on, stands for history as well as for all the other kinds of art. Learning about the history of their discipline can encourage modern STEM students to wonder why things came to be as they are and how they change. And it reminds them of the future possibility of having to relinquish the very ideas and facts that they're currently learning. This process can help them to develop a critical analysis that will really serve them throughout their careers. And teaching this history through visual representations of knowledge is a really powerful way to bring the past alive for modern students. It helps them to understand that throughout history, images have served as great equalizers. In the Middle Ages, when the Western world was just beginning to rediscover scientific inquiry, books were written out by hand and were extremely expensive to make, and they were also usually written in Latin, so only well-educated and affluent people could afford to buy them or read them. The invention of the printing press would eventually lead to books being made more cheaply and printed in more languages, but this process would take centuries. So for hundreds of years, images were the most effective way to communicate the widest range, the information to the widest range of people. We see this in some of the earliest almanacs in our collections at the Fisher. Images were used to explain things like the phases of the moon and which crops to harvest at particular times of the year. Illustrations were also used to indicate plants with medicinal properties in early botanical works called herbals. We also see the instructional properties of images perhaps best represented in the development of anatomical illustration. In the early 16th century, these were the kinds of illustrations that would accompany anatomy and surgery textbooks, because medicine at the time was still based on the teachings of Galen and other classical Greek physicians who had only dissected animals and not humans. But within the space of about 50 years, a man named Vesalius comes along, and we see anatomical illustration jump from this to this. This leap, of course, had a lot to do with Vesalius's interest in human dissection, giving him an understanding of anatomy that wasn't available to his predecessors. But I think it's important to acknowledge Vesalius's commitment to the artistic representation of this new anatomy. He was so invested in the accurate depiction of bodies that he hired the best artists and woodcutters of the day to produce these illustrations. The books that he published were explicitly meant to provide instruction. And so it was the incredible quality of these illustrations that was responsible for the incredible medical advances during this period. Throughout history, illustrations would continue to be integral to the training of physicians, from amazing engraved plates like these with movable flaps and parts so that students can disassemble and reassemble them, to later depictions of the inventions of new tools like forceps, for example, and instructions for their use. And as humanity became increasingly interested in understanding the natural world through the acts of exploring, collecting, naming, and cataloging, the accuracy of illustrations became extremely important for the development of these taxonomies. We see this in the rich artistic tradition of botanical illustration and in the documentation of animal and insect species in natural history. In many cases, it was necessary for these 17th and 18th century scientists to have some artistic training so that they could make sketches of their discoveries while they were out in the field. This tradition of scientists with artistic ability is much more well established than we might initially think. Da Vinci is probably the most often cited example, and his conflation of art and science is beautifully represented in his illustrations for this book by the mathematician Pacioli, in which he examines the divine proportion. But Robert Hooke, for example, famously drew and even carved the plates for the illustrations in Micrographia, in which he popularized the scientific use of the microscope. The images in this book caused a panic in London when people realized that these were the creatures living in their clothes. Robert Boyle also drew many of the images that explained his experiments with air pumps. In cases like these, it was really the graphic representation of these scientific advancements that captured the imagination of the public. And in turn, at this time, we see science becoming the focus of works of art as artists become increasingly interested in realism. There also exists a strong tradition of book owners coloring in the engraved plates, which would have been originally printed in black and white, in order to better understand the ideas being described. Examples like these demonstrate the tradition of complex scientific concepts being made accessible and intelligible, especially to a general audience, through the act of representing them visually. So to sum up, my understanding of the A in STEAM includes both history and art, because the study of history demonstrates the fact that science and art have always been fundamentally intertwined. And it can help us to imagine the ways in which the two disciplines can continue to inform and complement one another in the future. Thanks.
So we are actually inviting all our guests to sit here, and we need 2 hours of discussion now. So I have, I ask you to pass on the microphone. You can just speak into it. We will try. Okay. So we will pass on the microphone. I don't know if people from home will actually hear the questions, but I'll try to repeat them when it's possible. Otherwise, if you can just say a few things, just to put your answer in context. Okay. So I don't know if anybody wants to start. I have a lot of questions and comments, but yeah, you should.
My question is for Jen. When you were compiling the list of C words, I wonder if one of the candidate words was contribute.
Excellent. So you asked if contribute was one of the C words. I hadn't consciously thought of it because I thought already there's too many of these that seem too positional, right? And not enough that seem to be a partnership. And so I didn't want contribute because I didn't want another one that was in support. But I think it's certainly apt. I wouldn't see any reason that we wouldn't say contribute, as long as it's mutual, right? That's the big hang-up with those C words, is that they seem one-sided, that they seem too much like arts and everything else in support of all-knowing, all-powerful STEM. And let's get rid of that.
Who was first? Okay, so Doris and then...
You teach children, young children, and they do not differentiate between arts and science. So where do you think, because you see them as they grow up, by the time they become Gen students, they already think they know what they know and think they are what they are. So when does it happen?
When does the breakdown happen? You mean, when does separation happen? I'm really not sure where that happens. I mean, I think we have to, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that is kind of missing in the conversation, I don't know how to really wrap my words around it, but I think there's also a whole piece around gender here, and I think that often I want to say it's the fault of culture, because I see these kids and I watch them from the time they're in kindergarten to the time they're in grade 8, and they so differentiate themselves. At the very early age, they're so oral. That's the storytelling and the oral, that's where they are. But as they get older, they just, that adolescent thing, they kind of isolate, within themselves in a way that I think we've all kind of been through to some extent. I don't know, I think it's adolescence, but I think it's our culture as well. I think it's a cultural piece myself, but that's my opinion. I don't know. Could probably have 40 answers here about that.
I'll ask you something. I haven't really picked that, but I think that none of you actually addressed the question of search for the truth or the ultimate nature of reality. And these two disciplines, art and science, they're both trying to figure that out, but in a different way. And for both of these cultures, extreme training is required. So they cannot just mingle. I'll do a little science and then, no, you really have a talent and you need talent for both. Like my husband is an artist, and he says, I hate that architects are doing it. They always think they're so talented, but they're not. They just know the craft. They don't have a talent. So also for mathematics, I can do as much as you not force me, and I can be on a very low level. I don't have a talent, I realize. Some people just have a talent for that. So, but then they have to actually, how should I say, nurture that. And that's why they go to separate schools. Somewhere they converge. Arthur Kessler wrote a very good book called The Sleepwalkers when he was trying to get that schism between religion and science. And then he was also pointing to that in one point of time they were together and then they split. But Leonardo is the only one who had both of these talents together as a citizen of the world or Renaissance man. The others have these separate talents. So the search for ultimate nature of reality, which is a basic philosophical question, is involved. And they have to separately go to it. So my question for all of you, whoever wants to address that, how do you address this schism in regards to the question of the interpretation? You know, was doing both. He was doing magic as well. Probably, you know that.
I guess I'm thinking about from an art perspective. I guess I personally see art as a way of thinking, and it's not after something absolute. It's about a process, and it's also merging or valuing. Like I was realizing we use scientific systems all the time, or at least we do things that look like science. So I guess I feel that what art contributes is something that's open-ended, that is inclusive, that well, it depends on what you mean by art, I guess. That's the other thing, because I realize we all had different meanings to art.
Probably not that. I'm talking about art now.
Not just one little bit of art, though.
That's a big one.
Not in contemporary art.
Do you have to have it? Okay. So I think
people were talking about how art can contribute ethics to and judgment, those kinds of things, to science. But I'm wondering if it could happen the other way around, because I don't see a whole lot of evidence of ethics in art. And I wondered if that's...
So, can I just repeat the question, because people are like, they're not hearing, because when you're turning your back, it's impossible to hear. Yeah, no, I mean, I heard your question. I'm just repeating to other people. So she was asking whether the question of ethics can be only contributed by arts or also by the sciences, because it looks like it's the arts that are contributing the ethics, but also the sciences are. So what is the role of both in contributing to the ethics?
Art doesn't give a lot of art. What I would consider isn't any more
doesn't take into the consequences any more than science does. And I just wondered how science.
Yeah.
If I could, I think it's a great question. I think so. What I love about the framing that I think everyone here put on all of this is, so I think there's a little more acknowledgement that the A in STEAM belongs there, but I think it's been driven by kind of a misapprehension of the value. So I think a lot of the why the A needs to be there has been driven by the same thing that people use to justify why equity and diversity and inclusion are important, an economic argument. People are saying, oh, you need to have arts because it'll teach you new things for, to develop this technology or a new direction. And I think all of us here are saying there's actually the bigger question. It's history. It is objectivity. It's these bigger challenges. When I look at what science can bring to discussions of ethics and arts, I think we're seeing it's raising new challenges. So we are seeing literary authors start to explore science fiction a little bit, in that we're seeing they're realizing, okay, how are we going to deal with genetic engineering in this world? The question did not just come from arts like this might be a potential. It comes from a technological capability, and the way we can game this out, the experiment we can run, is in literature. It's by seeing what might it be like in society, not in a test tube when this happens. I think we're seeing a lot of that. A lot of scientists do read. They might read genre works, but in some ways it's exploring some of these bigger human-scale questions with a scientific framework, and I think that's fantastic. I think this connection, this artificial distinction, is weird because the impact of everything we create is expressed in society, not only in the abstract. I mean, I'm leaving aside purely theoretical works, but everything else is very much a part of regular society.
Just a very brief thing to add about science maybe addressing some of the ethical concerns of art. I think that I'm not a visual artist, so I can't speak to all different kinds of art, but there are certainly the kinds of ethical concerns that come up for me in terms of art are things about privacy. What's that amazing Susan Sontag book, like looking at the suffering of others, looking at war photography and things like that. And just the first example that popped into my head was that I don't know how many visual artists do things like get ethics approval, for some of their projects. A lot of the steps that scientists who are especially working with humans in any way have to get before they can begin their projects. Could be an interesting way to look at it, that artists could maybe take some of those kinds of established parameters from science and apply them in various ways.
I'm just wondering, as an extension of that conversation and the concept that it seems to me that always misses in these conversations is that boundary between your discipline or your ability to delve deeply into your subject knowledge versus your ability to communicate that information across boundaries, and how institutionalized. What are the barriers in terms of that institutionalization of that thinking? When you consider that we're human beings in all of these disciplines, that in itself is a subject, is the bigger umbrella, I think, the bigger question, the idea of objectivity, the idea of truth, is this same idea of ethical inquiry, and where the institution, how your institutions contribute or not, or is that where we really should be focusing the attention as opposed to the baseline question, is there a difference between, why are we stuck at this question, or whether there's a difference between art and science, when really are we not really talking about institutionalization issues? I'm not sure if that was a question there. I think there is a question there, which I'm curious to hear how you guys feel about it.
It was a question about the boundaries of what is the value of institutionalization in society, in limiting our interdisciplinary approach, right?
I guess what I'm asking is, shouldn't the
be asking a different question.
Okay.
And what the institutions that you are part of, or your discipline are part of, either contributing or developing beyond into a bigger question.
So
I'll speak briefly to that because I think that goes back to something Richard was saying about, we have to think carefully about the problems that we want to solve, right? And I think about it from a public school perspective, that there's a big push on STEAM and there's a big push on inquiry in general, but there's no conversation about ethics whatsoever. Yeah.
I'm also thinking at a very simple level, it's the issue of language. That we have, like artists have a language, and it's a very excluding language, and science has, and technology, there's all these areas within STEM too that all have different languages, and there's this challenge of crossing that. Like, so if you look at where do the barriers come, I think that's a crucial one, and within the disciplines there's also language barriers, like who speaks which kind of art language.
Thank you. So an anecdote, I was in a conversation with a historian colleague of mine, and we were lamenting I thought we were lamenting that silos were a real problem on our campus, and that we ought to get rid of silos because they were keeping us apart and they were these arbitrary barriers to the kinds of collaboration we ought to be doing. And he said, deadpan, what's wrong with silos? That's where you put the valuable stuff. And he's not wrong, right? Thank you for the pity laugh, everyone.
In Alberta, that would have killed.
But I think there's that attitude, right? We all love our disciplines, so we want to preserve the languages, and we like to communicate with each other, but we still think what we do is really important and valuable. And I think there is some fear that if I cross this boundary, I will have diluted somehow my own thing, or I will have been co-opted, or I will be supporting your thing instead of doing our thing. And I think many of us can probably tell stories of times that happened and that went awry, which is like reinforcing that fear. You asked particularly about our own institutions, and I can say that it's helpful to be at an undergraduate liberal arts college because at least the pamphlets say that we are all about students gaining multiple ways of knowing, multiple perspectives, and emerging fully engaged citizens of the world. And if that doesn't mean that you looked through a variety of lenses and got a prismatic education, which means the more lenses means you see more light and you see more color, then I don't know, like we're not delivering on that. That's what's on the pamphlets.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can echo the thought that so there's value in diving deep into things, right? There's certainly value in saying, I'm going to focus and get further. But just because, and maybe I have an aptitude and that's the area I want to specialize in, but just because something is hard for me to branch out into doesn't mean I don't need to do it. I think one of the areas, so medicine is an area where there used to be this sense that, it was just about solving the problem, and the actual human scale, the human involved, the patient in this was really kind of just getting in the way of my really, using a really great drug and publishing a really great paper about this treatment. And we've come a long way, or we're getting there anyway, with programs like McMaster that are really looking at interdisciplinary ways, collaborative teams, and really treating the patient as an important part because that has valuable medical outcomes. Treating me as a human being, and it has ethical outcomes, and they've really tried to say that's a conversation we need to have, even though it's less focus on the exact problem. And I think we need to do this in more fields because human beings are affected by more fields. So yeah, we need to have that disciplined deep dive. But if along the way we're missing the ethical implications, we're missing the impact on society, and we're missing the impact on the environment, then we're actually doing a bad job. So we can't sacrifice one for the efficiency of the other.
Go back, and then
So, philosophy student turned software engineer, and it strikes me that ethics actually is present in STEM, but it's a sort of pared down version where we talk about professional ethics. We talk about here are the guidelines for staying out of trouble, as opposed to here's the long, complicated, and problematic history of thinking about value in terms other than money. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Thank you.
Amen. I have to repeat.
Oh my God, this is going to be difficult. So talking about the ethics. So what is the difference between the ethics that are taught to us at the university as a way to stay out of trouble and not be accused of liability or something like that, right? And the ethics as in like taking responsibility for our own work, right? Is that this one, right?
More or less so, ethics in philosophy is about the evaluation of the nature of value and what values to pursue. And I find that in a professional context that gets subsumed by just economic pursuit and professional ethics, behavioral guidelines.
Yeah, so it's not just a question of staying safe in academia. It's also a question of how you market yourself and how you stay afloat in a highly hierarchical and highly innovation-driven type of system that thinks about economics more than about philosophy.
And how do you make room? How do you put an A in STEM when a lot of STEM practitioners already think that there's an ethics in there, there's an aesthetics in there?
Yeah, right.
All right. Still amen. But also, I think one answer to your question is design, and the way we teach engineering design anyway is inherently ethical. You are forced to think about what is this problem? Who are the people I want to help? What do I know about them? What social institutions are they involved with? What are all the networks? By the way, none of that is STEM, but that is critical to doing engineering design well. And if you think that way, and we ask our students, in the first engineering design course they have, first semester, what work are you going to do, and how will you know it's good work? Which is fundamentally a philosophical question. They have no framework by which they don't say, well, Kant says this. They have to think about what does that mean, and some of them say, I'll be well paid. But we can break that down. I would say the fundamental thing that I try to do is help people understand not what ethics prevents them from doing, but what ethics will permit them to do. And that's embedded in the way we do design.
So to your point, I'm a computer scientist, so I totally agree with you. The two ways we usually handle ethics is either just professional ethics, or it's half a lecture in week 11 of one class that you get, and great, now we did the ethics, we can check it off the undergraduate learning outcomes, and we're done, we finished it. Whereas what I think the question is, it needs to be an underlying fundamental stream throughout all of it. Right? I mean, we need in the same way that thinking through systems thinking approaches is a fundamental shift in the way we think of it. The biggest challenge for that is, that's not how I was taught. And I teach the way I was taught, mostly. It's not the way my colleagues were taught. We perpetuate that, whereas what you're describing is a shift in thinking that isn't, that I'm perpetuating the pre-shift version. And, the only answer to your question of how do we make that shift is with difficulty. I mean, that's all I have. It is hard, but yeah.
This isn't quite the question, but what I'm really aware of is in the arts, and I'm talking literature, across the board, ethical questions constantly emerge and people get called on it publicly. And I'm just thinking that doesn't happen in the sciences in the same way? Because everybody gets called. I've been called. You do something, and then the sort of the cultural framework changes, and then somebody says no, something is wrong with it. Mm-hmm. And that's an ongoing conversation in the arts. It's endless. It's on Facebook all the time.
Actually, oh my God, we have so many people. So we have a person in the back, and then Peter, and then a person down there, and then another person here. And then another person here. So, and we have 5 people. I think we're gonna
wrap up after this.
Unless you have like something really urgent, but like let's listen to these people.
Hi, my question is about what are the challenges and the problem that you have realized on integrating art on STEAM, which is art doesn't have some physical things that happen. Like, for example, gravity is not a problem that when you see some angels on the pictures, but in the other side, in STEAM, you have to follow rules. So what is the challenge? Because I think the art is to make the student more creative. And what happens when you are ruled, you are framed, and creativity is lost from my perspective. So what are the challenges of teaching these two things?
Do I have to repeat? So you were asking about what are the challenges of and the barriers to creativity, and what are the challenges in the face of the priorities that the different disciplines have, basically.
Yes, from STEAM, you have to follow rules, physical rules, gravity is always there, for example.
So okay, so in STEM, I guess, or in STEAM. In STEAM too, okay. So in STEAM you have to follow the rules, which are physical rules, while in the arts you're...
It's something that you don't have to...
Yeah. So you can basically create a universe that doesn't have gravity, for instance. So while in STEAM you have to.
Is there any impact on teaching art? It's going to make the student more creative, to innovate, to change the rules, for example. Is that one of the aims?
Okay, so in the face of this, is STEAM going to improve creativity or stifle, basically?
So I could say, I mean, there can be rules in art too, right? I mean, perspective can be a thing. It depends on, and if that's the effect you want, those are rules. It's just about your frame of reference. And the same thing is true in science. You can adjust your frame where in a theoretical, in a frictionless plane, calculate the, right? I can suspend rules in a particular frame. That's a useful thing to shift my frame of reference. I do that in science. I do that in math. I do that in art too. Yeah.
I think the nature of art in itself is the model for how to break the rules. I think it's by looking at art in all of its different forms that you have a clue to making art, really, and to teach I don't know you can teach creativity per se, but I think that by showing people what others have done, like kind of what you were showing, Lauren, that's I don't know, I'm not saying this very well, but that's how you teach creativity, just by art.
Just something small to add. I think that also a lot of the best art has been produced through the use of putting many rules in place. I think very few artists set out to just create, from nothing, from like with a completely blank canvas. So many, there have been amazing, literary projects where people will only, do writing while they're in transit, or they, people sort of, I think it's Roubaud who only wrote while the sun hit his desk during certain times of the day. And there are all kinds of artists who set certain parameters of restraint for themselves, and it's through those various constraints that they are most creative. So I also think that to say that art is just completely rule free is maybe not quite accurate.
So I was just going to add, I'm not sure the question is the rules as much as the fact that there are standards, and art has to be critiqued. Like, it's not everything is good art, or is art even. And
I'm on easier at saying this, but I think there's a structure for evaluation. Yeah, go. Yeah. Yeah, so there's this long history, there's a framework, but I think what's really crucial is as you're going along you're really evaluating whether it's derivative, for example.
Okay, I think there was Peter and then 3 other people. Yeah, Peter, 2 other people. I'm counting people, don't worry. I'm God.
So I have 5 thoughts that hopefully will get your coherent idea that you're reacting. So I think the first thing is that I think from a historical perspective, it's important to realize how recent, our contemporary idea of what art is, right? So it's something that, and also how culturally specific it is, right? So I'm not an art historian, right? But this idea of fine arts or high art or gallery art as distinct from craft and design is very recent. And even like Andy Warhol was talking artists and design at the same time. That was very recent, right? So I think that in terms of how art could fit into STEAM, or in other words, how it can fit into life, I think it might be important to look at things that persist even when you defund art, just to understand what these naturally occurring things might be, right? Okay. So, for example, one theory is, given that we're configuring our environments to survive and thrive, like what philosopher John Dewey suggested, I'm not an expert on this, but this example works for me, is that aesthetic cues that we associate with art, like balance and harmony, are cues that help you configure your environment to survive and prosper. That's one concept for it, right? But of course, you're not thinking about that when you're doing it. You're pursuing something that's aesthetically interesting when you configure your house, or you're designing an automobile. Okay, I teach design. Okay, so then we've invoked this optimization example a lot, right? Okay. And it's not always been positive, right? But when you think about, when I talk to an artist, or I've done art, or I talk to a mathematician, or a physicist, or an engineer, all of us, and I've worked in several of these fields, we're doing that. This optimization, I think we use words like elegance and beauty. Like you talk to a mathematician about trying to construct a proof. It's truly elegant, okay? It's like the same muscle that's going on when some computer scientists produce an algorithm, right? And they use words that we associate with aesthetics and beauty, okay? And other things, so we talked about like science fiction things. That's an example of an art form that persists even if, the government stops funding art. People write stories, and they've been doing it since ancient times. And things like robots, a lot of these concepts, are sort of prototype there. And they sort of react to the technology at the time, and then it influences culture, and it introduces concepts, right? That like Big Brother, like the surveillance concept that even a politician would use now. That was created by a writer, Orwell, right? Okay. So the most important thing I want to bring up as we try and think about what these different things are might be maybe think about learning styles. Okay, so as I move between different fields, when I look at the real difference, because really these things all seem the same. Okay, like the creativity, scientists are very creative, engineers are very creative. Okay, artists are good at designing systems and machines, and they work with materials all the time. But what I found is maybe different learning styles, and so maybe this STEAM concept, maybe what it could afford for us is thinking about different learning styles where someone might start out with drawing and making, okay, and get towards mathematics and algorithms and computer science. Someone else might start, who's very verbal, might start in another direction and get there. And then someone else who has a natural aptitude for math might then work towards these other things that we associate with these other things. That's my final thought.
I'm not going to be.
I like that a lot. Yeah. I think that's a very nice model, a nice, I guess, answer to what we're talking about. That it does, it's not silos. It's that one integrated thing.
Okay, so was there a question?
Oh yeah, I did something. I kind of forgot my original question. So sorry. No.
This is like it's a journey of the democratic hands-off.
Yeah. So hello, my name is Jill, and I teach in the Center for Drama and Performance Studies in Indigenous Studies and Transition Media program. And as I've been listening, I'm even troubled that there has to be acronyms like STEM and STEAM, and what's the A for in STEAM, and silos or no silos, and I'm wondering if we don't need to blow up some of the silos and start from the ground up from the kids. I think in my own culture, I'm an Anishinaabe woman. In my own culture, in my language, there's no word for artist because we all lived an artful life. And the first lessons you learned were, I guess, one might call them ethical lessons: love, respect, humility, 7 grandmother teachings. We could just call it Manoba in my language, which is the way of good life. So am I saying, okay, all the kids now have to learn this? Well, maybe if not an indigenous way, at least maybe it needs to start with not what are you going to be when you grow up? A doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a fireman. Maybe it needs to start with who are you going to be when you grow up? How are you going to live a good life? How are you going to live Manoba? That is the way of living well, the way of living your life and walking through life so that everything lives well, so that life is sustained. And maybe that's the questions our kids at this age and through the university need to begin with. Maybe the very first courses our students will need to start taking are courses that ask that question, not just once or for a week or a module, but really force them into that engagement. And they'll find, as this gentleman here so beautifully articulated it, they'll find their way, they'll find their path. That wasn't really helpful, was it?
Amen.
If I may say something, that when you said, these acronyms, you know what? These acronyms are all made so that people get funding, so that people things they're not really useful, and so they're made for classification purposes. But the question here is, how do we change that? It's very difficult to do that. So we should listen more to people like you, but we should also convince all those politicians who, and not just politicians, also in general, we're kind of caught all into these several silos. So we should convince ourselves also. We should train ourselves to think otherwise. But yeah, those acronyms really they mean nothing. They sound nice, STEAM, but STEAM is actually I was thinking about STEM versus STEAM. STEM is it's very steep. It's very phallus. STEAM is very like fluffy and and that's the A in STEM. So maybe we are like by putting A in STEM, we are kind of starting dissolving a little bit this stiffness, but I don't know. Okay, so we have other questions. You have. Okay, so
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I just was thinking, a few people have now brought up these possibilities of very systemic shifts that would need to happen in order to accommodate all of these new discussions. And I feel like if that sort of a fundamental shift is going to happen, it would need to start at a very early age. And in your experience, what do you think the response would be on behalf of, the school board or the powers that be in public education? Is there even a possibility of reframing any of these, the sort of these very set parameters that children really do need to kind of decide from a pretty early age whether they're going in more of a scientific direction or more of a humanities direction? Like, where do you think the possibility lies to just reframe even that fundamental decision?
That's a big question. I mean, a couple of things come to my mind. I mean, I think I go back to what you were just saying, actually, Roberta, about money, because I was reading on the TDSB website the other day that the TDSB, has a backlog of repairs to its buildings of $3.7 billion. That's the Toronto District School Board. So, I was going to mention earlier the video that I showed, for example, was made by the TDSB media team. And 5 years ago, there was 37 people working in that media team, and now there are 4. 10 years ago, I had a full-time library assistant, and now I'm half-time for 800 kids. So I think it really does boil back down to money in a lot of ways, like I was saying about you, Linda. Like, I think the artistic process, I think teachers and children are really open to that, and I know from my own experience that I think it's kind of on a school-by-school basis that there's an openness to those kinds of ideas, and I think it's again, like I said, you can't legislate this stuff, but I think people just intrinsically are drawn to making things, and I think teachers are drawn to doing things and helping children make things and be creative. And so I think there is an opening, but I think it's just so tied up in bureaucracy and money that, and I think I also want to say, and I just feel like, I was trying to say earlier, I feel somehow art, I don't feel it's valued in the education system. What's valued is becoming a doctor and teaching science and I think, STEAM was created, like I said earlier, to get girls into engineering. Like there's all these sort of other sort of subtextual sort of goals that sometimes I feel like I'm kind of trapped in myself. But I mean, that's why these things are so good to think about. So I think there is a will for it, but I think it's just a matter of it rising to the top of the priority list, and I think that's up to us. That woman in the right there's been waiting for a long time, Roberta. Yeah, the very back.
1 and 2, and then we'll see if we have time for more questions. But and I think they are. We are quick.
Hi. I noticed Professor Lossman said something very succinct that sort of reflects, I don't know if you know the work of Morris Berman, Twilight of American Culture, the anti-intellectualism. I come from a background of teaching university-level classical music, and what I find is there's not just an anti-intellectualism against art, against science, and science against art. It's really within the stratifications of the artists themselves. The classical musicians don't learn poetry. They don't learn philosophy. And I find that, goes bilaterally. And I find that in science as well. So we're not just fighting against moving across the borders of mandatory courses. And I saw my students taking, introductions to geology. And I also saw people coming over to their intro to music. And they would learn about eine kleine Nachtmusik and sit around with commercial music. And I'm wondering, is there any way I got wrapped on my fingers several times for trying to teach mathematical concepts which directly relate to musical systems. and made the systems much more accessible for people, especially with language barriers, because most of my students spoke Korean as a first language. I'm wondering if you're seeing that. Of course you are seeing that. But I'm wondering how you deal with an 18-year-old who thinks the concept of Foucault doesn't apply to her when she's playing music that was written directly in response to postmodernism.
Take it away.
I mean, I think, I think on the very practical way, of what you're talking about, how do we start making some of these changes, helping people see the meaning and the reason why they might want to. I'm going to leave aside how we make administration see the value, but if I'm talking about your actual students, I mean, I think some of the value is in motivating it. I love the example, Jenny, what you were talking about, if you started your class or first year students with objectivity or discussion or some representation, that's going to be so abstract. And you know why you're doing it. Issues of representation are incredibly important, they're foundational too, but forget that. If I'm actually taking a photograph and I'm actually dropping, it sounds like you go through a lot of food coloring in your program. If I'm doing that, and now I have to say, wait a second, I'm making a decision about what's emphasizing this, and when I make this decision with the hardware I'm taking a photograph of, it's emphasizing this. If I make a different decision, it's emphasizing this. Okay, my choices matter. The aesthetics of my photograph matter in my communication. They saw, I made this one, and it was kind of slapdash, and I positioned things in a different way and adjusted the lighting, and that's connecting with people. So now I can motivate why I might want to think about, what do we call that? And here is this reading maybe on objectivity, but we're talking about actually concretely what's in front of you right now. I feel like, if we want to have these deeper conversations, and I know this about, when talking to my kids or grade school kids, you don't start with Foucault for a grade school kid. You can still talk about the issues, and you can get there, but you can start with things that are very practical, very tangible, and still allude to these larger issues because they are core. The representation is core to a lot of the ways that a lot of the conversations we're having, and we just need to make it appropriate to the situation we're in, the class we're teaching, the age we're speaking to. But we can talk about, the big problems and challenges of life to a 6-year-old. We can talk, it's possible to do this. We just can't beat them over the head with too big a book at the wrong time. I don't know. It feels like.
I also think there's issues of exclusion, and based on access to certain language, certain education, certain histories. And I'd say within a lot of the arts, there's academic and non-academic. And there's a whole group of people that feel excluded because they don't know Foucault, for example, or Barthes or somebody like that. And so I'm uneasy about the use of the language because of the issue of exclusion.
So could a key goal of inserting art into STEM be to raise doubts about the omniscience and omnipotence of science and technology?
I can hand you the mic if you'd like. If you'd like to drop the mic, I'll hand it to you.
I just love this one story that a woman named Jacqueline Duff, and she works at Queen's University in the medical science department. But she's a medical historian, and she talks about, and this is again my argument for including history in the A in STEAM. She talks about how she encounters all these first year med students it's already been ingrained in them to just completely revere everyone who's ever come before them in medicine. And so she gets them on the first day to go and look back and choose various people who were important in medicine and do a little report on them, and at the end declare them a hero or a villain. And then she says that invariably, even though some of these people were Nazi sympathizers or just horrible things, they always declare them heroes because they already believe in the omnipotence of science. And I think that they want so badly to believe in the tradition, in the sort of lineages of theory and practice in which they find themselves. And then she says that exercise isn't considered a success until somebody puts up their hand and says, well, I think it depends on how you look at it. And that's her argument for saying that, history, as one of the many facets of art, is something that can really imbue scientists with even just, this critical faculty to look at something that they're taught to believe in categorically and begin to sort of pick it apart. So, yes, I agree with you. But I would like to say.
Can we take one last question? It has to be quick, though. No, she was first. You go before. I don't know. You fight against each other.
I just wanted to say in response to all this, and again, it really begs the question because my job is to be a translator. Actually, I'm a scientist whose job is to translate science into layman terms for judicial purposes. So I know when I'm talking with people who love science, who are scientists, who dedicate themselves to science, they do not feel omnipotent or omniscient, because that's the whole point. I mean, the whole point is continual search for some clarity in the soup of knowing, and knowing that you don't really know everything, you don't really know anything, but you're forced to, when you communicate, to distill what you know or don't know into some kind of language other people can understand. So this concept of omnipotence or omniscience, it seems to me that it comes down to the end to human nature, or maybe it's gender politics, maybe it's the paternalization of society. I don't know. There are many levels to that, but I have an issue with saying the issue here is that, we've got to make, all of these other people who are scientists less egocentric, rather than thinking that they have the solution to everything. I think it's a two, I don't think fundamentally those issues. I think it's the pursuit of humanity and looking at psychology of things, the territoriality that people take, and all those other issues that we are really talking about. You're not, per se, the science itself, or as, per se, an artist itself, which is also a very deep discipline of people who want to look at it. It's the application, it's the prism, as you say, that you look through things, rather than the actual knowledge or the pursuit. Because it's like the Dalai Lama, is an amazing guy if you look at how he approaches life as a spiritual person. It's the translation that things get so screwed up. Because he would never say he knows everything there is to know. He knows the path to life. And the same for scientists. I have a problem attack, a discipline of looking
I simply have to respond to that. I feel like it's not like science is reaching at the certainty. It is trying to pin down facts. It's trying to, find knowledge. But art is doing the opposite. It is negative capability, as Keith said. It is being able to live in uncertainties because according to Keith, Shakespeare had that ability to be in states of uncertainty so that you can pursue other interests better, like aesthetic and ethical concerns can take us away from the pride of knowing something and mastering something. This is more a kind of art is asking us to give up that power and be more like receptive, open, and be in states of uncertainty. So, depends on
the arts you're talking about.
Yeah, but mostly.
No, it's not mostly. Like many different arts are very like. So and the same with science. Like so many mathematicians are also philosophers, and they doubt themselves all the time. So like I think it depends. So I think what you're talking about is you're talking about a type of art that is like mainstream, or a type of science that is mainstream. This is what we are addressing. We're not addressing like the single scientist or the single artist. I think that if taken singularly, if taken individually, there's like a different values to each person, and I don't know, like maybe this is my, and again, like it depends on the experiences that we had of scientists and artists, and of course I'm kind of biased because I'm working with arts and scientists, and like of course the scientists I'm working with are very open-minded, but I don't know, and of course the artists I'm working with I'm very open, but like what about those who are like kind of looking at me from up and say, oh, there is no such thing as art and science, for instance.
I think Chandra got something very important that you said there, which is the art of living in uncertainty. Yeah. So
I think we should wrap up. I think we have one more question, and okay, one more question, and then we're wrapping up for real.
The meaning of the word art.
Well, I think what does art mean? So science, we mentioned science and medicine. Well, at one point, or at one time in history, the art of medicine was a very important thing. So how did a physician learn differently about the art of medicine, which we know in sort of an instinctive way is different from the science of medicine? And in fact, have we integrated this in the past and forgotten? Or has there been a path that has been more integrated and more humanistic? I don't know. I'm a physician. I know what the art of medicine means. Hard to teach, hard to define. It seems like something.
So what does it mean to you?
It's a different way of thinking about the person in front of you, the problem in front of you. It's a different way of thinking about things. So we talk about art and creative process. I'm a painter as well, so I have a foot in each. Whatever. Don't want to polarize it, but it's a different way of thinking about it. Asking different questions, standing in different places. Art language. But there's an embodied sense about the art of medicine, the art of science. That's really intriguing. And I'm intrigued that the way everybody has talked about art is a little different. And it's hard. It's hard to put a finger on it. It's easy to put your finger on mathematics or statistics, but much harder. It's a different fish in that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 level.
I think the only thing I would add to that, which is very well put, is I see a lot of nods. We're saying, yes, it's hard to define. Yet we have an art department, we have an art class, and in science, we're instituting perhaps an artificial barrier between something we acknowledge is really fuzzy and has things to say to one another. And I think the point of this is to say, how do we become more accepting of that fuzziness and those barriers a little bit, because our institutions and thought processes and our funding processes right now.
Standing harder back. Standing harder back.
Actually, people they keep raising their hands, but unfortunately, I told you that it would take us 2 hours, right? Unfortunately, we have to wrap up, also because there's people who need to clean the place, and we actually respect their labor. Because technically this place is closed at 5, so they're waiting outside for us to finish. So just to wrap up, thank you so much for this fantastic panel. Thank you, Lauren, Jan, Linda, Richard, and Jan. And thanks to the audience. And I also wanted to to give some special thanks to David and Dolores Steinman. David Steinman for suggesting this panel and for bringing us Jan, and Dolores Steinman for suggesting other speakers and for helping me coordinate this. If you Sci Salon, come look at the website. We're going to have something big at the end of January. Thank you very much.